The black helicopter arrived every Tuesday at dawn. There was never a radio call to the tower, never a transponder signal on the tracking monitor, and no identifying numbers painted on the matte-finished fuselage. There was only the low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated the reinforced glass panes of the hangar before the aircraft even cleared the jagged pine line of Legacy Ridge, Montana. Garrett Vance would hear the rotor blades cutting through the heavy mountain air before anyone else. He would set down his metal coffee thermos, wipe his hands on a dark grease rag, and step out onto the snow-dusted concrete apron. Two men in unmarked charcoal flight suits would slide the cabin door open, quickly unloading 3 heavy, sealed aluminum cases wrapped in industrial anti-static film. They never exchanged greetings. They never looked Garrett in the eye. One of them would walk to Garrett's battered 1998 Ford pickup, drop a heavy canvas pouch filled with tightly banded sequential $100 bills onto the driver's seat, and walk back to the idling chopper. Within 90 seconds, the aircraft would lift back into the gray winter sky, disappearing over the peaks toward the west, leaving Garrett alone in the freezing mountain wind. Inside the back office of Ridgeview Flight Services, the air smelled of old paper, kerosene, and the sharp sweetness of maple oatmeal. Lily, Garrett's 7-year-old daughter, sat on a stool near the cast-iron stove, her thick wool socks pulled up to her knees. She was deeply engrossed in a worn library book, her small fingers tracing the lines of text. She had her father's steady, dark eyes and a quiet resilience that belonged to someone much older. She didn't look up when the hangar doors groaned shut, sealing out the wind. Garrett pulled off his heavy canvas jacket and walked into the office, resting a calloused hand lightly on Lily's shoulder. At 38, Garrett possessed a quiet, rugged masculinity that commanded respect without him ever having to raise his voice. His face was etched with the lines of a man who had survived a harsh environment and a deeper, unspoken grief. 5 years ago, after his wife Sarah passed away, Garrett had cut all ties to the coastal corporate tech world, moving back to this isolated valley to run a modest aircraft maintenance hangar. The town Jadifel knew him as a reliable, tight-lipped mechanic who could fix any engine on a bush plane or a tractor, but they knew nothing of the life he lived before arriving in Montana. Clara Boyd was already at her desk, a steaming mug in her hand. A 60-year-old retired military logistics coordinator, Clara had answered Garrett's help-wanted ad 4 years prior and had stayed ever since. She didn't ask questions about the Tuesday morning deliveries, but she understood their gravity. In the back of the office stood 4 heavy industrial matte black safes. Every Tuesday, after the helicopter departed, Clara would open her private olive drab logbook and record the unique alphanumeric serial numbers stamped on the aluminum cases. She maintained this secondary tracking system with absolute, flawless precision. By mid-afternoon, the horizon turned a bruised, violent purple as a sudden mountain blizzard began rolling over the ridge. The wind howled against the corrugated steel roof of the hangar. The local radio station warned that the pass was completely closed, grounding all local traffic. That was when the scream of a twin-engine corporate jet pierced the storm. Garrett walked to the hangar window, watching as a sleek, multi-million-dollar private aircraft cut through the blinding snow, its landing lights slicing the whiteout conditions as it taxied aggressively toward his ramp. The engines whined down to a high-pitched idle, and the air stair lowered. 3 people stepped out into the freezing wind, hurried along by an assistant holding a massive golf umbrella. Leading the group was Audra Sterling. At 35, Audra was the formidable, brilliantly ruthless CEO of Sterling Aerospace, one of the largest defense and commercial aviation contractors in the world. She wore a tailored black cashmere coat that was entirely unsuited for a Montana blizzard, her diamond watch catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the hangar as she stepped inside. She looked around the rustic facility with a mixture of intense irritation and cold disdain. Her assistant, a nervous young man holding a tablet, rushed forward toward Garrett. "We need immediate hangar space and a primary diagnostics tech," the assistant barked. "Our starboard auxiliary power unit is throwing an amber warning code. We cannot be delayed here." Audra stood in the center of the hangar, her arms crossed, her eyes sweeping over the worn tools, the ancient grease extractor, and finally landing on Garrett, who stood calmly in his stained work shirt. "Is this the only maintenance facility within 50 miles? Audra asked, her voice dripping with icy authority, speaking to her assistant as if Garrett weren't standing directly in front of her. "Yes, miss." "Sterling," the assistant stammered. "The main airport in Helena is completely socked in." Audra sighed sharply, turning her cold gaze to Garrett. "Fine. Mechanical tech. Listen to me closely. I am in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition negotiation in Seattle. My aircraft is equipped with highly proprietary, sensitive avionics systems. I want your hands kept strictly away from the core flight management computers. You are authorized only to check the external bleed valves on the lower cowling. Do not touch anything else. I cannot have a small-town grease monkey compromising the integrity of my fleet. Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't defend his credentials, nor did he alter his calm, grounded posture. He simply looked at the sleek fuselage of the aircraft, then back at Audra's arrogant, tense expression. The wind shook the metal building. From the open office door, Lily stepped out, holding her book tightly against her chest, looking at the intimidating woman who was speaking so harshly to her father. Garrett walked past Audra without saying a word, stepping into the biting cold of the open ramp to secure the aircraft's wheels. But as he passed the lower fuselage of the advanced jet, his ears caught a very specific, irregular, high-pitched oscillation coming from the avionics cooling bay. It was a faint, metallic vibration that any normal technician would miss. Garrett froze. His jaw tightened as a flood of memories rushed back. He knew that exact sound. He had heard it years ago in a classified testing lab. It wasn't a simple warning code. It was the catastrophic harmonic resonance failure mode of the Stratos 9 flight stabilization matrix. A system he had personally engineered, and a system he knew was secretly doomed to fail. The high-pitched whine from the belly of the corporate jet grew more erratic, a metallic hiss that resonated deep within the concrete floor of the hangar. Garrett stood perfectly still on the wet apron, his eyes narrowed as he focused on the lower access panel near the wing root. To an ordinary mechanic, it sounded like a routine compressor bleed. To Garrett, it was the sound of a countdown. Before he could speak, the cabin door opened wider, and the third passenger emerged into the biting Montana wind. It was a young boy, no older than 6, wrapped tightly in an oversized wool blanket. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than a dislike of stormy weather. He was hyperventilating, his small chest heaving rapidly as the howling wind ripped the breath from his lungs. Julian Croft, the young assistant, was trying to guide the boy down the slippery air stair, but the child froze, gripping the handrail and sobbing uncontrollably. The extreme turbulence of the mountain crossing had shattered his nerves. "Leo, stop this instantly," Audra said, stepping toward the stairs. Her voice was sharp, a command honed in boardroom negotiations, but beneath the steel, a sudden fracture of pure panic vibrated in her tone. "You are safe. The flight is over. Stand up and walk inside." The boy only cried harder, his tiny hands trembling violently against the freezing aluminum rail. He couldn't breathe. The tight, controlled mask Audra wore completely dissolved. The powerful billionaire CEO, feared by executives across the aviation industry, looked suddenly, utterly helpless. She reached out to grab her son's arm, her own hands shaking, her instructions becoming frantic, disorganized, and breathless. "Leo, please. Look at me. Breathe. You're making it worse. Just breathe." Her wealth, her corporate empire, her private security detachments, none of it could buy her the ability to calm her suffocating child in the middle of a mountain blizzard. She was drowning in her own anxiety, her eyes darting around the rustic hangar in desperate, chaotic vulnerability. Garrett stepped forward. He didn't rush, yet he closed the distance between them in a few long, measured strides. His presence was an immediate anchor against the storm. He bypassed Audra gently, his broad frame blocking the freezing wind from hitting the little boy. "Hey there, bud," Garrett said. His voice was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of panic. It was the calm, grounded tone of a man who held the weight of the world without flinching. Leo looked up, his tear-filled eyes locking onto Garrett's steady, dark gaze. Garrett knelt down on the cold metal step, completely ignoring the snow piling on his shoulders. He didn't touch the boy forcefully. He just placed a heavy, warm, reassuring hand on the step beside Leo's foot. "My name is Garrett. You see that big iron stove inside the office over there? It's got a fire roaring inside, and my..." The boy took a ragged, trembling breath, his crying slowing down just a fraction, caught by the strange, commanding stillness of the mechanic. "Sink our engines?" he whispered. "Yeah," Garrett said, offering a slow, warm smile that radiated absolute safety. "When a plane goes through rough air, its engines get out of rhythm. Your engine is running way too fast right now. Look at me. Watch my chest." We're going to pull in a deep breath of air, hold it for 4 seconds while the pressure stabilizes, and then let it out real slow, just like a pressure release valve. Ready? Garrett took a deep, steadying breath. Leo watched him, his small chest mirroring the slow, rhythmic movement. Inhale. Hold. Release. Within 3 cycles, the boy's hyperventilation stopped. The trembling in his hands subsided. Lily stepped out from the office door, carrying a thick, warm fleece blanket. She walked over quietly, without a sound, and wrapped it around Leo's shoulders, giving him a small, understanding nod. "Come on inside," Lily said softly. "I'll show you my book." Leo let go of the handrail, stepping down into the hangar. He instinctively reached out and took Garrett's hand, trusting the quiet strength of the rugged mechanic completely. Garrett guided him into the warm office, while Audra stood frozen on the apron, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at her trembling hands, then at the back of the man who had effortlessly restored peace to her chaotic world without asking for a single thing in return. For the first time in her life, she realized that true power had nothing to do with money. As Garrett walked back out of the office, his expression hardened, returning to the business of the aircraft. He walked straight toward the jet's cockpit window, where Captain Thomas Brody was looking down at his instruments. Garrett tapped on the lower fuselage panel, then looked directly at Audra, who was watching him with a mixture of profound gratitude and sudden, intense wariness. "Your warning code isn't for an auxiliary valve, miss Sterling," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a cold, authoritative precision. "Your internal cooling line for the main flight stabilization matrix is cracked. The computer is choking on its own heat. If you take off into that storm, the core avionics will completely fry before you hit 10,000 feet, and you'll lose all control of your primary flight surfaces." Audra's eyes widened, her defensive corporate instincts slamming back into place. She stepped closer to him, her posture turning defensive, her gaze drilling into his face. "How do you know that term?" Audra demanded, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. The Flight Stabilization Matrix architecture is a highly classified proprietary military system owned exclusively by Sterling Aerospace. It hasn't been released to the public, and it's certainly not found in standard civilian maintenance manuals. "Who exactly are you, Garrett Vance?" Audra's voice hung in the frigid air of the hangar, sharp and demanding. Her assistant, Julian Croft, immediately stepped forward, tapping his tablet with an aggressive flick of his wrist. "Miss Sterling, I'm running a background query on this facility now," Julian said, his eyes scanning the screen. "It's a basic Class 4 field maintenance station. There is no record of military clearances or advanced aerospace contracts here. Mr. Vance is likely referencing leaked schematics from the black market forums. I can contact our corporate security detail in Seattle to have this facility flagged." Garrett didn't even look at Julian. He kept his eyes locked on Audra, his posture perfectly steady. "Your assistant can call whoever he likes," Garrett said quietly. "But while he's making that call, the residual heat from your secondary turbine is migrating straight into the composite housing of that matrix block. In about 4 minutes, the housing will warp. When it warps, the pins will shear." Before Audra could reply, Captain Thomas Brody descended the air stair. The seasoned pilot looked pale, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing draft blowing through the open hangar doors. "Miss Sterling, the primary flight computer, just dumped its backup cache," Brody reported, his voice tight with alarm. "The stabilization loop is dead. I've lost all feedback in the yoke. We're locked down." Audra turned to Brody, her jaw tightening. "How is that possible?" "This aircraft underwent a full system overhaul in Chicago less than 48 hours ago. The Chicago depot doesn't test for high-altitude thermal shock in active blizzards," Garrett stated calmly. He walked over to a heavy rolling tool chest, selected a precision micro-torque wrench and a localized thermal scanner, and walked back to the aircraft's underbelly. "Open the access panel for the lower avionics bay, Captain. Let's show your boss what she paid for." Brody looked at Audra, waiting for her command. She stared at Garrett, trying to find a tremor of uncertainty in his face. Finding none, she gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "Open it." Brody bypassed the digital lock, lowering the heavy composite panel. Immediately, a wave of distinct, ozone-scented heat rolled out into the cold hangar. Garrett didn't hesitate. He stepped beneath the fuselage, his movements fluid, precise, and entirely devoid of the clumsy hesitation typical of a standard commercial mechanic. He didn't look at a manual. He reached into the dark, cramped wiring bay, his fingers instantly finding the primary high-pressure line. "Hold the light right here, Captain," Garrett instructed. Brody aimed his flashlight into the bay. Garrett adjusted the thermal scanner, angling the digital screen so Audra could see it. On the display, a bright, glowing crimson line showed a severe heat spike radiating from a tiny hairline fracture in a specialized titanium manifold. "That's a Revision 3 bypass manifold," Garrett explained, pointing to the glowing fracture with the tip of his wrench. The engineering team at Sterling Aerospace tried to save weight by reducing the wall thickness of the fluid channel by 2 millimeters. They thought the internal cooling jacket would compensate for the stress. But when you fly through a rapid pressure drop at sub-zero temperatures, the fluid thickens, the pressure spikes, and the manifold splits. It's a systemic design flaw. Captain Brody gasped, leaning in closer. "How could you possibly know the internal wall thickness specification of a Revision 3 block? That data isn't even in our flight crew emergency directives." Garrett pulled his hands out of the bay, wiping the synthetic hydraulic fluid onto his rag. "Because it's a bad design," he said simply, refusing to expand further. Audra stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She looked at the fractured manifold, then at Garrett. Her mind, sharp and analytical, was racing. She knew every line item of her company's engineering reports. The issue Garrett just described had been raised as a minor hypothetical risk by an anonymous whistleblower in their research division 6 years ago. But the report had been buried by senior vice presidents to keep the production timeline on track. For a mechanic in an isolated Montana valley, to point it out instantly meant he either possessed terrifyingly accurate intuition or he was someone who had intimacy with the core blueprints. "You're not a field mechanic," Audra whispered, her cold eyes searching his face. "Who are you, Garrett?" Instead of answering, Garrett turned his head toward the glass window of the back office. Inside, the rustic room was glowing with the warm amber light of the wood stove. Through the glass, Audra saw her son, Leo. He was sitting close to the fire, a mug of hot chocolate resting in his lap. Lily was sitting right next to him, her library book open between them. She was pointing to a diagram of a constellation, explaining it to Leo with a soft, patient smile. Leo wasn't crying anymore. He was listening intently, his small shoulders relaxed, completely safe within the perimeter Garrett had built. Audra looked at her son, and for a fleeting moment, the ruthless corporate billionaire vanished. A profound, aching exhaustion washed over her face. She smoothed down her expensive cashmere coat, her hands trembling slightly. "He hasn't smiled like that in a very long time," Audra said softly, her voice dropping its defensive armor for the first time. "Ever since the divorce and the corporate restructuring. My life has been an endless series of flights, secure boardrooms, and threats. I thought I could protect him by controlling everything, by buying the safest assets, by building the highest walls." "You can't buy safety from a storm, Miss Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying the deep weight of a father who had buried his own wife. "And you can't command a child to stop feeling afraid. They don't care about your balance sheets or your corporate acquisitions. They just need to know that the man or woman holding their hand isn't going to let go when the ground starts shaking." Audra looked at him, the silence between them stretching long and heavy, filled only by the roar of the wind outside. Suddenly, Julian broke the silence, rushing over with his tablet held high, his face completely pale. "Miss Sterling, you need to see this immediately. Our internal corporate compliance network just triggered a high-priority anomaly alert." Audra snapped back into her executive posture. "What is it, Julian?" "The serial number on the diagnostic scanner, Mr. Vance just used," Julian stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Garrett's old tool bench. "And the specific automated tracking protocol running on his office computer. It just pinged our classified logistics database. He isn't just running a local shop, Miss Sterling. Look at what's registered to this coordinates." Audra snatched the tablet from her assistant's hands. Her eyes scanned the encrypted screen, and as she read the high-security clearance log, her breath completely caught in her throat. She looked up from the screen, her gaze shifting to the 4 massive, matte black industrial safes standing silently in the back of Garrett's office. Julian Croft's fingers trembled so violently against the edge of the tablet that the digital screen rattled. He looked up at Audra, his voice stripping away all corporate arrogance, leaving only a raw, naked panic. "Miss Sterling, these coordinates aren't a blind spot on our map," Julian stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the 4 massive black safes standing in the shadows of the back office. "They are registered under a restricted Department of Defense logistics protocol. 10 years ago, under your predecessor's administration, a quiet operational mandate was established. Every time a Stratos 9 stabilization matrix suffered an unmapped core failure in the field, the cracked modules weren't destroyed. They were quietly shipped here, in secret, paid for in untraceable corporate contingency cash. Audra felt the blood completely drain from her face. She looked from the screen to Garrett Vance, who stood perfectly still, his large frame cast in the low amber light of the hangar. The safes? Audra whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. What is inside them, Julian? The evidence, Julian breathed, staring at Garrett as if looking at a ghost. 10 years of documented engineering failures. Hundreds of them. Every single module that our legal team claimed went missing in transit. But that's not all, Miss Sterling. The original architectural patent for the entire stabilization matrix. The uncorrupted baseline code before the board ordered the modifications to save manufacturing costs. It's locked under a biometric encryption key registered to a single person. Julian turned the screen toward Audra. The high-security file displayed a photograph from a decade ago. It showed a younger, clean-shaven man in a pristine United States Air Force officer's uniform, standing in front of an experimental stealth prototype. Beneath the image, the text read, Chief Aerospace Engineer, Commander Garrett Vance. Status, resigned. Location, classified. Audra's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Garrett's calloused hands, his faded work shirt, and the absolute lack of pretense in his rugged posture. The man she had just dismissed as a small-town grease monkey was the legendary aviation architect whose sudden disappearance had nearly crippled her company's research and development division. Julian, desperate to regain his footing and protect his own position, stepped forward aggressively, his voice rising in a sharp, defensive sneer. You think you're clever, don't you, Vance? You stole proprietary baseline data when you walked out on your contract. You've been sitting here in this pathetic, freezing shack, hoarding stolen corporate property, letting our reputation take the hit while you collect under-the-table hush money from crooked logistics managers. You're not a hero. You're a thief who couldn't cut it in the real world, hiding behind a child in the middle of nowhere. Captain Brody stepped back, his expression one of pure shock, but Garrett didn't move an inch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react to Julian's bitter humiliation. His quiet masculinity remained entirely unshakable, a steady mountain against a howling dog. I didn't steal anything, son, Garrett said quietly, his dark eyes fixed on Julian with a calm, terrifying weight that made the young assistant instantly freeze. I built it. And when your board decided to alter the safety parameters of the cooling jackets to increase their quarterly profit margins, I gave them a choice: fix the architecture or find another engineer. They chose to rewrite the documentation and erase my name. I didn't take the modules to hurt your company. I took them because every time one of those units cracks in midair, a pilot's life is on the line. I kept the records because someone had to keep the truth. Before Julian could fire back another insult, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently. A sharp, explosive pop echoed from the main power transformer attached to the exterior wall of the hangar. Instantly, the entire facility plunged into pitch-black darkness. The roaring scream of the blizzard outside surged in volume, slamming against the corrugated metal walls like a physical blow. The main heating system groaned, its blowers whining down to a dead, hollow silence. Within seconds, the freezing mountain air began to rapidly bleed through the structure, the temperature plummeting toward zero. From inside the dark office, a sharp, terrified cry pierced the silence. "Mom?" Leo screamed, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming panic as the darkness triggered his trauma from the turbulent flight. Audra instantly lost all corporate composure. She stumbled in the dark, her expensive heels slipping on the cold concrete. "Leo, I'm here! Leo!" she cried out, her voice completely breaking as she ran blindly toward the sound, crashing into a heavy, rolling tool cart. She was entirely helpless, her wealth and status useless in the absolute blackness of a mountain winter storm. She was suffocating in her own terror, unable to find her child. Suddenly, a powerful beam of light sliced through the darkness. Garrett didn't panic. While everyone else froze, he became perfectly steady. He didn't run, but his movements were fast, deliberate, and certain. He kept the flashlight steady, illuminating the path to the office door. He walked past the trembling Audra, his large hand gently catching her shoulder for a fraction of a second to steady her. "Stay behind me. I've got him," he said, his low voice instantly cutting through her hyperventilation like an anchor. Garrett stepped into the office, kneeling immediately beside the trembling boy. Leo was sobbing, his eyes wild with fear. Garrett didn't hesitate. He pulled off his own heavy canvas jacket and wrapped it completely around Leo's small frame, lifting the boy into his arms and pulling him tight against his chest. Lily stood right beside them, holding a mechanical, crank-powered lantern she had calmly retrieved from a bottom drawer, her face showing no fear because she trusted her father completely. "I've got you, bud." The grid went down, but our perimeter is holding, Garrett whispered into Leo's hair, his heavy arms providing an absolute shield against the freezing dark. Leo immediately buried his face into Garrett's neck, his breathing slowing down as he absorbed the mechanic's unshakable warmth. Audra watched from the doorway, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she saw her son find instant safety in the arms of a man she had deeply insulted less than an hour ago. But as Garrett stood up, his flashlight beam accidentally caught the underbelly of the corporate jet parked in the center of the bay. A heavy, thick plume of pale blue, toxic vapor was beginning to rapidly vent from the cracked bypass manifold. The rapid temperature drop from the power failure had completely shattered the warped titanium housing. The pressurized chemical coolant, highly lethal if inhaled in an enclosed space, was venting directly into the hangar's main air ducts, migrating straight toward the office where they stood. Garrett's jaw tightened as the digital scanner in his hand began to beep a rhythmic, high-pitched warning code. "We have a localized containment breach," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a cold, military urgency. "The jet is venting pressurized coolant gas. In 3 minutes, this entire room will be toxic, and the storm has completely blocked the main hangar doors from opening manually." The pale blue mist crept through the overhead ventilation grates like an alive thing, twisting in the beam of Garrett's flashlight. The air immediately turned sharp, carrying a chemical odor that burned the back of the throat. "Clara!" Garrett called out, his voice a low, steady rumble that instantly halted the rising panic in the room. "Take Lily and Leo into the deep battery locker in the northwest corner. The door has an airtight rubber gasket. Take the crank lantern and shut the door behind you. Do not open it until I knock 3 times. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lily's hand and scooped Leo up from the office chair, moving with the practiced efficiency of her military past. Lily didn't cry. She looked at her father, gave him a small, determined nod, and pulled the heavy fleece blanket tighter around Leo as they disappeared into the shadows of the back hallway. The heavy iron latch of the battery locker clicked shut with a solid, echoing thud. Audra moved to follow them, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Garrett's large hand firmly caught her forearm. His grip wasn't violent, but it was unyielding, grounding her spinning mind instantly. "I need you out here, Audra," Garrett said, looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. "If we don't isolate the primary accumulator tank on your jet, the pressurized chemical vapor will expand until it compromises the entire structure. The automated ventilation is dead without the main grid. We have to shut it down at the source." "This is a Class 3 toxic containment emergency," Julian Croft screamed, his corporate composure completely shattered as he staggered backward toward the ballistic glass windows. "We're going to suffocate in here. Vance, you idiot. Break the windows. Use a sledgehammer. Break them now." The windows are double-paned, reinforced polycarbonate designed to withstand high-altitude bird strikes and 80-knot mountain crosswinds, Garrett said without even turning his head to look at the frantic assistant. "A sledgehammer will bounce off the frame, and the exertion will only force your lungs to inhale the vapor faster. Sit down on the bench, cover your mouth with your collar, and stop moving." The absolute authority in Garrett's voice was absolute. Julian choked on his next word, his knees buckling slightly as he sank onto a wooden workbench, burying his face in his tailored sleeves, trembling violently. Garrett turned back to Audra, handing her a heavy, rubber-coated tactical flashlight. "Keep this light pinned directly on the lower inspection bay right beneath the starboard engine intake. Do not let the beam wander. Can you do that?" Audra swallowed hard, her fingers locking around the cold metal casing of the flashlight. She was a billionaire executive who commanded tens of thousands of employees from a penthouse office in Seattle, yet right now, holding a flashlight in a freezing, dark hangar in Montana felt like the most critical task she had ever been assigned. "Yes," she whispered, tightening her jaw. "I've got it." Garrett stepped beneath the belly of the massive corporate aircraft. The pale blue vapor was venting in a steady, whistling stream from the fractured titanium manifold. The toxic mist coated the metallic surfaces, turning them slick and deadly. Without a word, Garrett reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out a small, specialized pneumatic block tool, an instrument he had kept in his personal collection for 10 long years. Audra held the light steady, her eyes tracking his movements. She watched as Garrett bypassed the primary computer locking mechanisms completely. He didn't look at the diagnostic screen. His fingers moved with a terrifying fluid memory, feeling for the hidden mechanical overrides hidden deep within the structural frame of the Stratos 9 stabilization matrix. "You're bypassing the digital safety solenoids," Captain Brody remarked, leaning in from a safe distance, his eyes wide with professional astonishment. "The emergency manual states those valves can only be commanded through the primary cockpit avionics terminal with an engineering override code." "The emergency manual is wrong," Garrett muttered, his shoulder muscles straining as he forced a heavy mechanical lever upward against the pressurized resistance. The software developers at Sterling Aerospace added the digital lockouts to comply with commercial aviation regulations, but the physical architecture still relies on a manual tertiary override. It's located exactly 3 inches behind the main hydraulic return line. Audra's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, the freezing cold of the hangar completely forgotten as she stared at the side of Garrett's face. That specific engineering detail, the tertiary manual override hidden behind the hydraulic line, was a classified military contingency mechanism. It had been built into the original stealth prototypes to allow fighter pilots to manually isolate system damage during active combat if their computer networks were fried by an electromagnetic pulse. The civilian versions of the jet were supposed to have that mechanism completely removed during production to lower manufacturing costs. "Garrett," Audra said, her voice trembling as the light shook slightly in her hand. "The board voted to strip the manual overrides out of the commercial production line 9 years ago to maximize cabin space. How is that linkage still inside my private aircraft? Because when I delivered the final master blueprint to your predecessor, I refused to sign the safety certification unless the mechanical failsafes remained intact," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly precision. "The board might have lied to the regulators, and they might have erased my name from the patents, but they couldn't rewrite the physical tooling dies at the manufacturing plant without shutting down the entire assembly line for a year. They left it in because it was cheaper than re-engineering the hull." With a final, powerful surge of strength, Garrett threw his weight against the hidden lever. A loud metallic clunk echoed through the hollow interior of the jet. The whistling sound of the venting gas instantly died out. The blue vapor stopped pouring from the fracture, leaving only a thin, dissipating haze hanging in the cold air of the bay. Garrett pulled his hands out of the access panel, his knuckles bleeding where they had scraped against the sharp titanium frame. He didn't look at the blood. He simply wiped his hands on his dark grease rag, his expression as calm and unbothered as if he had just changed the oil on a farm tractor. Audra lowered the flashlight, her gaze fixed on the blood on his knuckles, then up to his steady, unreadable eyes. The silence in the hangar was deafening, filled only by the distant, muffled howling of the blizzard outside. Julian slowly lifted his head from his sleeves, coughing weakly as the air began to settle. Captain Brody stood frozen, looking at Garrett with a profound, professional reverence that bordered on awe. "You saved our lives," Audra said softly, her cold, corporate shell completely gone, leaving only a mother who knew her child was safe because of the man standing in front of her. "If that gas had reached the office, if you hadn't known exactly where that hidden linkage was." "I didn't do it for your company, Audra," Garrett said quietly, stepping out from beneath the fuselage. "I did it because the kids were in the building." Suddenly, Captain Brody's radio clipped to his flight jacket crackled to life, a sharp, static-laden voice breaking through the quiet room. "Captain Brody, do you copy? This is Sterling Corporate Dispatch in Seattle. We just received the automated telemetry alert from your primary avionics bay before your grid went down. We need an immediate status update on the aircraft." Brody snatched the radio, pressing the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Brody. The aircraft suffered a catastrophic manifold failure. The hangar lost power. We had a toxic containment breach, but it's been manually isolated by a local technician. We are locked down until the storm clears." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the static hissing rhythmically. When the voice returned, it wasn't the corporate dispatcher anymore. It was a sharp, arrogant, older voice that Audra recognized instantly. It was Daniel Crane, the senior vice president of engineering and the man who had claimed credit for the Stratos 9 architecture. "Brody, this is Crane," the voice barked through the small speaker, vibrating with an intense, hidden panic. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not let anyone touch that maintenance bay. Under corporate emergency protocols, that aircraft is a proprietary crime scene. If any local mechanic has accessed the internal matrix block, they are in violation of federal espionage statutes. You are to lock the aircraft immediately and wait for our corporate legal detail to arrive. Audra snatched the radio out of Brody's hand, her eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous fire as she pressed the button. Daniel, this is Audra. The local mechanic didn't violate a statute. He just saved your CEO and my son from suffocating on your poorly manufactured hardware. The manifold cracked exactly where the whistleblowers said it would 6 years ago. A dead, heavy silence fell over the radio line. For 5 agonizing seconds, only the hiss of the storm filled the airwaves. When Daniel Crane spoke again, his voice had dropped all executive pretense, turning cold, calculated, and sharp as a razor blade. Miss Sterling, Crane said quietly, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. You might be the CEO, but the board owns the proprietary licenses to that stabilization system. And if a certain retired military officer named Garrett Vance is standing anywhere near your aircraft, he needs to know that his 10-year hiding streak just came to an end. The click of the radio cutting out echoed like a gunshot through the freezing, dark hangar. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a decade-old secret finally cracking wide open. Garrett did not move. He stood beneath the massive, wounded wing of the corporate jet, his expression cast in deep shadow. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, rugged remote fob, and pressed a single black button. A second later, a deep, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the concrete floor from an exterior equipment shed. A massive industrial backup generator roared to life. Overhead, the auxiliary high-intensity halogen lamps flickered twice, then surged with a brilliant, glaring white light that banished the darkness. The harsh illumination cut through the remaining thin wisps of blue chemical vapor, painting the entire scene in the clinical light of a laboratory. Garrett walked directly to the airtight battery locker. He rapped his knuckles against the reinforced steel door 3 times. The heavy iron latch pulled back, and Clara stepped out, shielding her eyes from the sudden glare. Right behind her, Lily guided little Leo by the hand. The boy's face was still pale, but his breathing was perfectly steady. The moment he saw the open hangar, he didn't run to his mother. He looked straight at Garrett, his eyes shining with an absolute, unshakable trust. Leo let go of Lily's hand, walked over to Garrett, and gently touched the mechanic's oil-stained coveralls. Is the storm over, Garrett? He asked softly. The perimeter is perfectly secure, Bud, Garrett said, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the child. He gave Leo a gentle, reassuring pat on the shoulder. The air is clean, and the lights are back on. Go on over to your mom now. Leo turned and walked toward Audra, who fell to her knees on the cold concrete, wrapping her arms around her son as if she had just pulled him from a burning building. She buried her face in his hair, her shoulders shaking with silent, ragged breaths. The powerful, terrifying CEO of Sterling Aerospace was completely gone, replaced entirely by a vulnerable mother who had just witnessed her child being saved by the very man she had tried to humiliate. Julian Croft, however, saw the restoration of light as his cue to regain control. He scrambled off the workbench, straightening his rumpled designer tie, though his face remained entirely bloodless. He marched toward Audra, his voice rising in a sharp, desperate panic. Miss Sterling, we have to act immediately, Julian urged, his eyes darting toward Garrett with venomous intent. You heard Vice President Crane. Vance is a rogue element. He is in possession of classified aerospace property. If corporate security is already tracking this location, we are legally compromised just by standing here. We need to order Captain Brody to seal this aircraft, lock Vance out of the facility, and wait for the legal team to arrive. This man is a threat to the entire corporation. Captain Brody didn't move. He stood near the open avionics bay, his arms crossed over his chest, looking at Julian with absolute disgust. Shut your mouth, Julian, the pilot said, his voice dropping into a hard, professional growl. Mr. Vance just kept this entire hangar from turning into a toxic tomb while you were busy crying into your sleeves. If he wanted to hurt this company, he could have just walked out the door and let us suffocate. Audra slowly stood up, her hand resting protectively on Leo's head. The vulnerability in her eyes rapidly hardened, transforming into a cold, dangerous fury as she looked at her assistant. Julian, she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying whisper that made the young man instantly freeze. If you say one more word to leverage legal threats against the man who just saved my son's life, I will personally strip you of every asset, every security clearance, and every corporate credential you possess before we leave this valley. Do you understand me? Julian swallowed hard, stepping back into the shadows, his mouth clamping shut. Audra turned her gaze back to Garrett. She looked at his bleeding knuckles, his steady, unyielding posture, and the quiet dignity that money could never duplicate. "Garrett," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "What did Crane mean? What is he trying to hide?" Garrett didn't answer with words. He walked past her, his heavy work boots thudding rhythmically against the concrete. He walked straight toward the 4 massive, matte black industrial safes standing against the back wall of the office. He didn't use a key. He placed his thumb against a concealed biometric glass panel hidden beneath a heavy steel lip on the primary safe. A low, electronic chime sounded. A circular green ring illuminated the dark steel face. With a heavy metallic groan of shifting deadbolts, the massive door swung open. Audra and Captain Brody stepped into the doorway of the office, their breath catching in their throats. Inside the safe were no stolen weapons or corporate briefcases. Instead, there were rows upon rows of neatly organized, heavily padded military-grade logbooks, stacked alongside hundreds of miniature clear storage vials. Each vial contained a tiny, fractured piece of sheared titanium hardware, perfectly preserved and tagged with an exact date, time, and flight coordinate. Garrett reached into the top shelf and pulled out a thick, leather-bound master ledger. He walked back out to the main workbench, throwing the heavy book down onto the metal surface with a loud, echoing thud. He opened it to the very first page. 10 years ago, I didn't run away because I couldn't cut it, Julian, Garrett said, his voice echoing through the vast hangar with an unshakable cinematic gravity. He looked directly at Audra. I ran away because 3 test pilots went down in the Mojave Desert during the initial prototype phase of your stabilization matrix. The telemetry data showed the cooling line ruptured, causing a total flight surface lockout. Daniel Crane was the deputy director back then. He went to the board, falsified the crash logs, and blamed the pilot errors to keep his government funding. Audra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Mojave crashes. The official record stated it was an atmospheric microburst. It was a lie, Garrett said calmly, his fingers tracing a meticulous handwritten log of the structural failure analysis. I refused to alter the safety certifications, so Crane had my clearance revoked, stripped my name from the patent architecture, and threatened to use his political connections to ensure I'd spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary for industrial espionage if I ever spoke out. I had a 2-year-old daughter to raise alone. So I took the true telemetry data, I took the original uncorrupted code, and I came here. He turned the page, revealing a stark, high-resolution physical photograph attached to an internal corporate memorandum dated 9 years prior. The document was printed on official Sterling Aerospace letterhead, and at the bottom, scrawled in a bold, aggressive hand, was a direct signature. Audra leaned over the workbench, her eyes scanning the faded ink. Her breath completely trapped in her chest as she recognized the name written in black ink, authorizing the quiet, off-the-books shipping of failed matrix blocks to an isolated maintenance yard in Montana to ensure the evidence never reached the federal regulators. The signature belonged to Daniel Crane. He knew. Audra whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of intense betrayal and absolute horror. He's known for 10 years. He's been using my corporate contingency fund to pay you to hide the evidence of his own fatal flaw. I didn't take his money to hide it, Audra, Garrett said softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a profound protective warmth. I took the modules because every time one of these units cracks, a pilot loses control. I kept the evidence because I knew that one day the architecture would fail on someone powerful enough to actually fight back. Before Audra could speak, a sudden heavy pounding rattled the thick pedestrian door of the main hangar, followed by the flashing red and blue strobe lights of a local emergency vehicle cutting through the swirling snow outside. The heavy steel pedestrian door groaned as it swung open, letting in a swirl of aggressive white snow and a blast of sub-zero mountain air. Standing in the threshold, illuminated by the flashing red and blue strobes of a heavy-duty four-wheel drive utility truck, was Sheriff Carter Hayes. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weather-beaten face, his khaki uniform jacket dusted with ice. Garrett, Sheriff Hayes said, his deep voice carrying the easy familiarity of a man who had known the mechanic for years. The main substation on the ridge blew out. Half the county is dark. I saw your backup halogens kick on from the highway and wanted to make sure you and Lily weren't freezing to death. He stepped inside, stamping the snow from his heavy winter boots, his eyes immediately taking in the massive corporate jet, the scattered high-tech diagnostics gear, and the presence of Audra Sterling and her team. The sheriff's hand instinctively rested near his utility belt, his instincts tuning into the thick, unresolved tension vibrating through the room. "Looks like you got a full house." "We're fine, Carter," Garrett said, his voice instantly lowering the temperature in the room. He stepped forward, shielding the open master ledger with his broad frame. "Had a localized system failure on the bird here, but we've isolated the perimeter. The backup generator is holding the heat." Audra watched the interaction, her sharp mind processing the absolute respect the local lawman showed toward Garrett. In her world, authority was demanded through legal teams, corporate titles, and financial leverage. But here, in this freezing valley, Garrett commanded authority simply by existing, a steady pillar of absolute reliability that the entire community anchored itself to. Sheriff Hayes nodded, his gaze lingering briefly on the crying Julian Croft and then on Audra, whose cashmere coat was stained with grease and water. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, offering a polite tip of his hat, "the State Department of Transportation just officially locked down the pass. Nobody is getting in or out of this valley until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. If you folks need emergency shelter, the town hall has the auxiliary heaters running." "Thank you, Sheriff," Audra said, her voice recovering its steady corporate cadence, though her eyes remained fixed on Garrett. "But we are perfectly safe right here. Mr. Vance has provided everything we need." Sheriff Hayes gave Garrett a knowing look, patted his shoulder with a heavy leather glove, and turned back toward the storm. "Keep the radio on, Garrett. I'll be patrolling the lower access road if the wind pulls down the lines." As the heavy door clicked shut behind the lawman, sealing out the howling wind once more, the silence returned, thick and electric. Audra walked slowly over to the workbench. She looked down at the bleeding knuckles on Garrett's right hand, the injuries he had completely ignored while saving her son. Without a word, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, and gently stepped into his personal space. Garrett didn't move away. He stood perfectly still as the billionaire executive reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrapped the soft silk around his scraped skin. For a second, her hand brushed against his calloused palm. The contrast was absolute. The soft, pristine world of extreme wealth, meeting the rough, unyielding reality of a man who worked with iron and steel. Yet, as Audra looked up into Garrett's dark, steady eyes, she felt a rare, profound sense of emotional security she hadn't experienced in years. "You've been carrying this entire weight by yourself," Audra said softly, her voice dropping all corporate armor, leaving only a genuine, deep-seated reverence. 10 years of keeping their secrets, tracking their failures, protecting the memory of those test pilots. All while raising Lily in the dark. "It wasn't in the dark," Garrett said quietly, his voice a low, comforting vibration. "Lily knows exactly who her father is. She knows we don't fix things just to make them look pretty. We fix them so they don't break when it matters most." From the office doorway, Leo watched them. Garrett's oversized canvas jacket still draped over his small shoulders like a shield. "Mom," the boy called out softly, "can we stay here? I don't want to go back on the plane." Audra turned to her son, her heart aching with a mixture of intense guilt and overwhelming clarity. She had spent his entire life building financial fortresses, thinking that money could insulate him from the harshness of the world. But in less than 2 hours, a quiet single father in a rustic Montana hangar had given her son the one thing her billions could never buy: absolute peace. "We're not going anywhere, sweetie," Audra promised, walking over to kneel beside him, pulling him close. She looked back at Garrett. "We are staying right here until this is finished." Suddenly, the sleek, high-tech satellite communications terminal mounted to the corporate jet's interior bulkhead began to flash a violent, rhythmic amber light. A high-priority encrypted data feed was forcing its way through the backup satellite uplink. Captain Brody rushed up the air stair, his face turning a ghostly shade of white as he read the incoming operational manifest on the cockpit display. "Miss Sterling," Brody shouted down from the cabin door, his voice laced with a sudden, terrifying urgency. "We have a massive security breach on the corporate network. Vice President Crane didn't just log our location." Audra stepped toward the stairs, her corporate instincts slamming back into place. "What did he do, Brody?" "He just invoked the classified asset protection protocol through the board's emergency executive committee," Brody stammered, his hands shaking as he held a printout of the encrypted data transmission. He reported to the federal authorities that this hangar is an active industrial espionage cell, and Miss Sterling, he didn't wait for the local authorities or the storm to clear. Brody looked down at Garrett, his eyes wide with horror. Crane just authorized a private, heavy-security tactical transport team from our defense division in Idaho. They've bypassed the county road closures using tracked military-grade Snowcat vehicles. According to the GPS transponder feed, they just cleared the Lower Valley checkpoint. They are coming to seize the safes, reclaim the aircraft, and arrest everyone in this building for treason. They'll be at our perimeter in less than 20 minutes. The distant mechanical growl of heavy diesel engines cut through the howling wind, vibrating the thick concrete floor of the hangar. Through the frosted ballistic windows, the powerful headlights of 3 massive tracked tactical snowcats pierced the blinding whiteout. They moved with terrifying precision, forming an aggressive semicircle directly outside the main bay doors. Julian Croft let out a ragged, hysterical laugh, scrambling toward the window. "They're here," he breathed, a desperate, twisted satisfaction returning to his voice. "Crane's team is here. It's over, Vance. You and your little hoarding operation are done for." Garrett didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the headlights outside. He stood beside the open safe, his face perfectly calm, a mountain of quiet masculinity that refused to be shaken. He turned to Clara, who was already standing by the office door, her hand resting on the grip of a heavy emergency radio. "Clara, keep Lily and Leo in the back room. Lock the internal deadbolt." "No," Audra said, her voice cutting through the panic like a razor blade. She stepped under the brilliant halogen lights, her posture rigid, her eyes flashing with a cold, absolute fury that belonged to the commander of a global empire. The vulnerability she had felt as a frightened mother had completely transformed into a weapon. She looked at Garrett, her gaze softening for a fraction of a second before turning to Captain Brody. "Brody, sync our satellite terminal's master broadcast channel to the global boardroom feed," Audra commanded, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy rhythm. "Patch it directly to the Department of Defense Compliance Liaison, the Federal Aviation Administration Oversight Committee, and every single member of the Sterling Aerospace Board of Directors. Use the Level 1 emergency override." Captain Brody's eyes widened, a slow, fierce smile spreading across his face. "Initiating broadcast link now, Miss Sterling. We are live globally in 10 seconds. The heavy pedestrian door was suddenly thrown open with a violent crash. 4 heavily armed corporate security operatives, clad in dark tactical winter gear, stepped into the hangar, their rifle barrels lowered but ready. Leading them was a cold-eyed commander who stepped toward Garrett with a high-priority federal seizure warrant held tightly in his gloved hand. "Garrett Vance." The commander barked. "By order of Vice President Daniel Crane and the Asset Protection Committee, you are in possession of classified military property. Secure your hands behind your back." "Stand down, Commander," Audra shouted, her voice echoing through the vast steel rafters with absolute, unyielding authority. The security team instantly froze, their eyes locking onto the CEO of the corporation that signed their paychecks. Audra walked past the armed men, completely ignoring their weapons, stepping directly in front of Garrett. Her broad frame shielded him from them, just as he had shielded her son from the storm. "Look at the overhead monitor," Audra commanded, pointing a single elegant finger toward the large diagnostics display mounted to the hangar wall. The screen flickered, instantly displaying a live, high-definition split-screen video feed. In the center grid was the high-security corporate boardroom in Seattle. To the left, a live feed of the Department of Defense Compliance Office. And patched into the audio line, screaming over a speaker from his penthouse office, was Daniel Crane. "Seize the safes." Crane's voice roared through the hangar speakers, cracking with a desperate, naked panic. "Audra, you are compromised. You are suffering from extreme duress due to the storm. Vance is a criminal who stole our core stabilization blueprints. Commander, arrest him immediately and clear the hangar." "The only criminal in this hangar, Daniel, is you," Audra said softly, her voice carrying an unshakable cinematic gravity that silenced the entire global feed. She stepped back to the workbench, slamming Garrett's master ledger down directly beneath the live high-resolution document scanner. The pristine camera feed instantly broadcasted 10 years of meticulously logged engineering failures, physical photographs of the cracked titanium manifolds, and Crane's own bold, unmistakable signature authorizing the illegal, off-the-books cash shipments to hide the fatal defects. For 10 years, you buried the evidence of your own engineering failure to protect your stock options, Audra declared, her eyes boring into the camera lens, projecting her image across the global network. "You blamed dead test pilots. You threatened the brilliant architect who designed the system. And tonight, your failure nearly killed my son." The global feed went utterly dead silent. On the boardroom monitor, the directors of Sterling Aerospace looked at the evidence with absolute horror. In the Department of Defense grid, a high-ranking general slowly stood up from his desk, his face turning a dark, furious crimson. "This is General Vance's original architecture," the Pentagon liaison stated, his voice vibrating through the line. "The uncorrupted baseline code is fully documented right here. Vice President Crane, your security clearances are permanently revoked effective immediately. Federal marshals are entering your building now." On the screen, Daniel Crane's face turned completely bloodless. He stumbled backward into his leather office chair, his phone slipping from his hand as the background doors to his penthouse office were violently thrown open by federal agents. The line cut to a dead static hiss. The tactical commander in the hangar slowly lowered his document, looked at the evidence on the screen, and then turned to his men. "Holster your weapons," he ordered quietly. He looked at Garrett, offering a deep, respectful nod of his head. "Sir, our apologies." The security team turned and marched back out into the blizzard, the heavy-tracked snowcats roaring to life and retreating back down the mountain pass, leaving the perimeter entirely clear. Julian Croft sank to his knees against the workbench, staring at the floor in a state of complete, ruined shock, realizing his corporate career was utterly dead. The next morning, the blizzard finally broke. A brilliant, blinding mountain sun rose over Legacy Ridge, turning the vast fields of fresh snow into a sea of glittering diamonds. The heavy hangar doors were fully opened, letting in the crisp, clean morning air. Audra stood on the concrete apron, watching as Captain Brody completed the final pre-flight checks on the newly repaired corporate jet. Garrett had spent the entire night manually fabricating a brand new reinforced steel bypass manifold using his old lathe, completely eliminating the structural flaw. Leo stood beside Garrett's pickup truck, wearing Garrett's heavy canvas jacket, laughing happily as Lily showed him how to properly check the oil dipstick. Audra walked over to Garrett, who was leaning against the bed of his truck, a fresh thermos of coffee in his hand. She looked completely different than she had 48 hours ago. The expensive cashmere coat was gone, replaced by a simple, rugged winter jacket. The cold, unapproachable corporate mask was entirely gone, leaving only a woman who had found her footing in the real world. "The board approved the full corporate restructuring an hour ago," Audra said softly, stepping close to him, the crisp mountain air carrying the warmth of her breath between them. "Daniel Crane's entire division is being dismantled. But we have a massive problem, Garrett. We have 3,000 aircraft worldwide that need their stabilization matrices completely retrofitted with your uncorrupted baseline architecture." Garrett took a slow sip of his coffee, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners with a quiet, rugged amusement. "Sounds like you need a good engineer." "I don't just need an engineer, Garrett," Audra said, her voice dropping into a low, emotionally rich tone as she reached out, her hand gently resting over his calloused palm. "I need a chief technology officer. Someone who cannot be bought. Someone who builds perimeters that actually hold when the storm hits." She stepped even closer, her eyes searching his face with a rare, genuine vulnerability. "I'm relocating the entire core research and development facility out of Seattle. I'm building a brand new state-of-the-art engineering center right here in this valley. I want to build something real, Garrett. With you." Garrett looked down at her hand, his fingers slowly turning to intertwine with hers, his strong, warm grip providing an absolute sense of emotional security. He looked out at Lily and Leo, who were currently chasing each other through the fresh snow, their happy laughter echoing across the quiet mountain valley. "The garage stays open on Thursdays," Garrett said softly, a slow, handsome smile breaking through his rugged features. Audra let out a soft laugh, her eyes shining with a profound, peaceful happiness. "The garage can stay open whenever you want, Chief." She leaned in, her forehead gently resting against his shoulder for a brief, beautiful moment of perfect closure, before turning to call her son toward the air stair. As the corporate jet finally lifted into the clear blue sky, turning back toward the coast, Garrett stood on the apron with his arm wrapped tightly around Lily's shoulders. The 4 black safes in his office were no longer a tomb of bitter corporate secrets. They were the foundation of a completely unshakable future.